Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We are here to give you an update on sort of mid-cycle on the 2025-2026 college admissions application cycle. And I'm Bari Norman from Expert Admissions. And then we also have Saha DeWind from Tutor Associates. So you'll get to hear a lot of the particulars about both the admissions and testing process. We got a lot of great questions in advance, so thanks to everyone for those. You'll be hearing responses as we go. We also encourage you to ask questions as we're speaking. We'll be monitoring the Q&A, so please put your questions there. And I'm also going to share a poll because we'd love to get a sense of who is here with us. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to get that going. And if you could let us know what grade you, if you're a student, or what grade your student is in, it will help us kind of help us tailor our responses and some of the content that we'll cover based on the audience. And while people are voting, and I see those votes coming in, so thank you. As I said, questions in the Q&A box, and please keep them coming. We'll do our best to monitor them. So it looks like we have a little over half who are here are in grade 11. And then we've got the next, actually, surprisingly, the next biggest group is other, followed by really literally even split between 9th, 10th, and 12th graders. So we've got almost like basically 60% 11th graders and then a mix of others. So I'm going to end the poll. Thank you. Almost every single person actually responded. And we are going to get started. What we're going to begin with tonight is a little bit about, we had a bunch of questions worded differently, but asking and getting at the same thing, which was just sort of a little bit wanting some insight into trends, what was the same, what's different, what are we noticing in college admissions? And so we're going to start there, and then we'll get into testing, and we'll really go back and forth as we talk this evening. But just a couple of things. I think we've seen anybody who knows college admissions, it's like there's different things and movement and change constantly. Like that's the one thing we can count on, is that things will be different every year, and where they'll be different, how they'll be different, why they'll be different also changes. So some of the things I think worth mentioning from this year, certainly a shift in some essay questions and topics. A lot more schools asking about how students engage with people different from them, how they build bridges, how they kind of, not surprisingly, given the world that we're living in and the political climate, sort of how do you bring people together? Or, variations on that. But I think that theme has come up in a way that didn't come up much at all, quite frankly, in past years. It doesn't mean that prior questions are gone. These questions were often added, or in certain cases, certainly swapped out for others. But I think that was something. We also saw places like University of Virginia, UVA, drop their supplements and go to no supplemental essays from like 2 or 3. So, we've seen that. We saw like fewer apps in ED at some of the Ivies and some other places. So ED numbers down. We saw that last year too, not surprisingly, where those numbers went down shifted. So Brown was down a lot last year. This year they were up and their admit rate was down. So using what happened last year to predict what was going to happen this year, although I would have said the fact that they were down would encourage a lot of people to apply and was going to move it up, which I think probably had at least something to do with it. The Michigan early decision, that was new this year, and it's been a, how shall I say, it has been a little bit of a messy rollout with some hiccups on their end as they kind of figure out the landscape from their end. And even just as the kids know who applied or might have friends who applied, even just their portal was having difficulty. So when students were checking their application status, it was confusing at best. So I think that it'll be better next year, and I think they've learned a lot. Certainly from the first round of decisions in particular, an early decision, but that was new. Next year, we've got USC just announced this past week that they're going ED for everywhere, all of their schools except for like cinematic arts and like music and theater and dance, like some of their audition-based programs, but they're going ED this year. It was just for business. There's also Georgetown is going to the Common App. Get ready, buckle up on that. That's going to almost definitely, that's almost definitely going to be a cause for applications to go up. We saw UVA applications go up quite a bit this year in early action. The fact that there were no essays played no small role in that. So we would expect with Georgetown going to the Common App that their apps are going to go up, their admit rate will go down. You heard it here first. We'll be talking about this next year on this same webinar. And so there's stuff all around. I mean, Tufts was up a lot. We could pop around and talk about all different schools, and most of them are up, some of them are down. It's still tough to get into. Kelly School of Business, my last one. Kelly School of Business at Indiana, no more direct admit. They now have a KPI, an inventory that you complete after you initially apply, and their admit rate went down. Their apps were way up this year, and that was before they won the football national championship. So again, just wait till next year. And so there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot of shifting and changing, like everything in admissions. It depends. What school are we talking about? But there's a lot of movement and change, but all stuff that's within the realm of normal for admissions, for college admissions. Sasha, can we flip over to testing, and maybe a good place to start, because there's been a lot of change with SAT and ACT in recent months and years, but I feel like it's kind of sort of evened out. So maybe we can start with timeline and sort of where people can start with testing, and then we'll come back to admissions.
I mean, I'm still shook by the Georgetown news because it's been just decades of Georgetown being on their own.
No one thought they'd see the
No one thought
day.
they would ever do it. So here we are. But as you said, some things change, some things stay the same. In admissions, I think the same thing is true for testing. And yes, it's always a delight when things are staying the same on the testing front, right? And mostly because it gives families and kids transparency, clarity, and predictability. And those things are really important in testing. So, I get asked all the time when to start, what's the right test, how do I know what to do and how to decide. So I think it's always good to start there and to ground in sort of what are your options now, because those options are always slightly shifting, and it's my job to sort of stay on top of those changes. So your options haven't changed. It's the SAT or the ACT. And, I still find myself reiterating to families that there really is no right test just from an admissions perspective. I mean, I know we all grew up in a different time where certain kids took one and the other kids took the other, and it was unheard of to consider whichever one you didn't take, but that's really not been the case for a long time. And from an admissions perspective, there's no preference. So it's really about taking the test that suits your child, and the one, if we're going to think of them as foreign languages, which's the one that your child can become more fluent in more quickly. Um, and the best way to figure that out is to try one of each. The SAT is a digital test. You can only take it digitally. It is an adaptive test. That means that how you do on the first part of the test determines what module or what section you're given later on in the test. And it's its own sort of it's its own sort of little language that you have to learn, but most of our kids like to try the digital SAT and see if it suits them. That's still out of 1600. So, we're kind of looking at those scores and thinking about why those scores look that way after a child takes the SAT diagnostic. And then the ACT offers digital and paper testing. Traditionally, we've been a pretty paper testing heavy company in the sense of we like kids to be able to scribble and but they get scrap paper for the digital test, and kids are increasingly digitally sort of fluent. So the ACT digital test is certainly a good option for our kids. And I should note that both the digital SAT and the digital ACT have a built-in calculator that is highly functional. It takes training, but it's really useful on those tests. And so there's a little perk of taking a digital test is that they have a sort of better calculator than just your graphing calculator. But before we get too into the weeds on these tests and how they are different and how they are similar, 10th grade is the time for most students to figure out the test for them. That does not mean it's the time to start tutoring. That's highly dependent on the child, but it is not unusual for kids sometime between now and late June to try diagnostics of each in close proximity to each other, usually one weekend and the next, and then to really inventory not just how they did, but why they did what they did. And I say that because a child who scores a certain score, but it was just all timing, but if they had finished, it would have been fine, is very different than a child who's missing content, had timing issues, was stressed. There's so many different layers to the whys. And so I think this is a good time as a 10th grader or an 11th grader if you haven't done it yet, but it's usually a time in 10th grade to plan. I'm a planner. I like to know what we're starting with. And the best case is you're great. You're close to your goals and you have a long time and you have plenty of time to get started. And then in our worst case scenarios where we have a long way to go, we have that time, we have that luxury to fill in those gaps, to figure out what needs to become sort of fluent. So 10th grade, maybe early summer of 11th grade before, all your kids go off on fun trips that I'm jealous of. That's the time to really pick a test and plan. And then preparation for that test.
Sasha, can I interrupt for
Please,
1 second?
always.
Because I think you make a good point, and there are it is logical to, if you, especially if you're a student or if you have a student for whom testing does not come naturally. And by the way, that is almost everybody, even the kids who are going to score a 35, 36, 1570, 1590. It's very rare. It happens, but it's rarer that someone is like one and done and did nothing to get there. It happens, but like that's not what you should bank on, even if you're going to be a student who's going to score high in the end. But if you have a student for whom it isn't sort of natural, or is going to struggle, you think is going to struggle, there's a logical sort of inclination to want to start early. And again, it makes perfect sense, like just in theory, about starting extra early, like in 10th grade, ninth grade, so that you have more time, you front load it so that 11th grade isn't as stressful. Again, all of it makes sense if you don't work with students actually taking these tests and in high school while they're doing it. The reality, and Sasha, if you have a different experience, please chime in, is that, the tests are really for kids of a certain age who have learned certain things in school and are at a certain developmental level. You can't force things like earlier if they're not there. So, especially if it's not your thing, tutoring a million hours just earlier when you're not ready yet and you haven't learned some of the content isn't going to give you, it'll give you a score, it'll go up a bit, but it's not going to likely give you a usable score, meaning you can submit it when the time comes. And a score is only usable and if it's submittable, if you're kind of going to be able to work for you. And we often find when students start too early, that they end up like plateauing and then burning out and getting kind of just just kind of feeling like discouraged because they're like, I've been working for X months, it's moved, but now it's sitting or it's not even still close to where it should be. And if they just started a little later, they would get to where they're going to get like faster and with a lot less stress and angst. And so there's often that inclination to start extra early. And I would just discourage people from necessarily doing that. Or if you're thinking about doing it, talk to a counselor, talk to a tutor to see if it really is, if your kid is the anomaly where it makes sense to do that. And Sasha, I don't know if you have
Yeah.
anything more to
No,
say.
it's such a good point, and there's so many things I have to say about that. I mean, when ninth graders come to me, I really just say, no, it's not the time. Now, if your child is weak in their math skills in ninth grade, if their grammar is a struggle for them, if their reading comprehension needs work, that is absolutely to be addressed in ninth grade, but not from a test prep standpoint, from an academic standpoint. And the most important thing you can do as a parent in ninth and 10th grade is set your child up academically for success. And I can't overstate that, because coming to me and saying, I want 35s, which is what everyone says, and please say it to me. That's great. But your child is has fundamentals missing and the grades are reflecting that. It's sort of it's the reverse way of looking at things, right? Ninth and 10th grade are for building the skills and making sure the grades reflect those fundamentals and those skills, building extracurriculars that are deep and interesting to your child and you like and are, all those things. So there is a too early for almost every kid. Are there exceptions? Yes. Do recruited athletes sometimes need scores early, even if the scores aren't perfect? Yes. Are there kids who are at boarding school and are super high performers and they get it done by fall of 11th grade? Of course. Those are the exceptions that make the rule. And again, ninth and 10th grade are for the skills that you need so that you can then become fluent in these languages. And then 10th grade is planning. I like to plan. And a lot of times you'll hear from me in our conversations. Oh, sorry, I'm getting up. Hold on. um, you'll hear from me that you can't um, sort of build those skills. You can plan, and then we're not going to do anything for a while. So you're going to hear a lot of like, great, here we are. Now we're not doing anything for a while. And I think that that's important too, that it can be too early to plan, but 10th grade is a nice time to plan. It doesn't mean you're starting to prep. And again, I have a 10th grader who is going to likely be a recruited crew person. I don't know the right rower, a
Rower.
rower, a rower. There we go. I got it. And that kid needs scores a little earlier, even if they're not the kinds of scores we tend to get. And sorry, my daughter is calling me over and over again. I'm gonna have to just, and I don't know why it's connecting. Um, and so I think that that's important to talk about. And Barry, maybe you can talk a little bit about the senior bump. Um,
I was just going to say on the other end of it, what we're talking about early, we just see so often a bump at the beginning of senior year period. And the students don't spend the summer tutoring. They go and do the thing that they need to do for their extracurricular profile. They're engaging in things, they're doing the things that rising seniors should be doing. They may or may not brush up a bit. Usually they brush up a little just because you're rusty. You don't want to be like reading the instructions or kind of like not have a sense. So they'll do a couple of sessions maybe or whatever they need right before and some independent stuff even because they usually had been tutoring for quite some time. And then they come in and they're fresh and like just a bit older and wiser and just like I always say, you can wipe the floor at the end of the year with an 11th grader. Like they're just exhausted. It's not the best time to be taking tests if you can avoid it, because you've got typically final exams. If you take AP or IBs, you're doing that. And 11th grade is just challenging and it's now you're at the end of it. So typically kids are exhausted and none of us tend to do our best work under those circumstances. So this bump at the beginning of senior year, and I don't say it lightly because, as the counselors, we're the one that like walk into the fire with students to the end, right? We're there when they're in ninth and 10th grade, kind of in all those planning stages, and we're there at the end, and we have a lot of people who help along the way, tutors, coaches, everything, but we're walking through to the last step. And so we really care what the reality is with the score, with the rigor, with the academics, with the engagement in extracurriculars, with the story, with the profile. And so when I say that I am optimistic about fall of senior year scores, it's saying a lot because I don't get excited so fast because I need it to actually happen. So, in order for it to work in a student's favor. So I'm a huge fan of beginning of senior year testing. We just see meaningful jumps over and over again.
and that brings us back to the other thing I wanted to address, which is Barry mentioned plateauing, which does happen. And it happens for a number of reasons. And I think it's helpful to understand sort of the three components to getting those really high scores on the ACT, SAT. And then I can sort of from backwards from that help you understand why children plateau. Barry brought up one of them, burnout, right? That's an important one. It's going to hit on one of those three things. But in order to get a perfect score or near perfect score, the score you're going for in these tests, you need a certain level of content and skills in place, right? That's the piece that parents usually think, oh, we can just do now. Well, no, you have to read at a certain level. We can, and the grammar and the math, but your children's schools do so much of that work for us. So while content deficits occur, while skill gaps happen, my tutors, that's not the thing they face most because our kids are so well educated. But so they come to us with these great grades in math, and then their math score doesn't reflect that. And I think it helps you to understand why. It's because there's these two other pieces to getting that perfect score. I'm using that as an example, of course. The first is you have to understand the language that you're speaking, right? And the SAT math and ACT math are two different languages. You know, the ACT covers way more topics than the SAT, but in a much sort of more straightforward way. The SAT is much more concentrated in the topics that they cover, but in a more intense way. So even that is different, right? And then there's ways in which they phrase the answer choices, ways in which they present things that are just patterns. And I understand the patterns of this test. And in order to beat the test, you have to know the patterns, big and small, and then you have to have procedures to manage those patterns. Every time I see a variable in the answer choice, I do blah blah blah. Every time I see a verb, I do X or Y because otherwise, you're just doing intuition or you're just relying on that content or those skills, and it's not enough to get you those scores. And then the final piece, which Barry alluded to earlier, is that there really is a performance piece to this. And this is why freshmen and sophomores are also not always great at these tests, right? Because you have to be confident and calm and manage some pretty intense feelings and emotions as you test. And as we get older and as we practice, we become better at managing those inevitable feelings. My kids who are tired in May don't do well on tests. I don't know why my college counselor told me to test in May when I was doing this many, many years ago, but I was a burnt out junior, and it's not a great time to test for the majority of kids. But February is a great time for most of our kids to test, or April, right? Right after spring break. It's a great time. May, not so much. Kids who are so stressed, they're tired, anxious, they're burnt out. They should not be sacrificing their schoolwork, their exams for their scores that they can do later. There are summer tests in some cases. There are early fall tests. So it's really that performance piece that I think is often ignored, and it's why we often see a disparity between a child's homework and their practice tests or official tests. And then the final thing is kids shouldn't be testing before they're ready. There's just a psychological component. We're talking about teenagers. We need to build their confidence. We need to have them test when they're ready to do well. It doesn't have to be their perfect final score, but they need to feel good about it. We need to be very thoughtful and intentional about when prep starts, when it's meant to end, when there's going to be a break, all of those things. And that's where the customization comes in. So anyway,
And we don't care when everybody else around you is testing. When they test, what they get has no bearing on which schools you're getting into. Only what you do is going to impact your results and your possibilities. So if your best friend is done, in October and has their score, great. Like it doesn't impact you. If they finish in the fall of senior year, it doesn't impact you. So it's hard, but really try to not worry about who's done, has taken it already. You haven't, you have. It doesn't matter. And nobody on the admission side is looking
at the
at
date.
when you took the exam. They just want to see what score you got. And they want, ideally, what we want is for them to look at it and take about 1 second and move on.
Yeah.
That's what you're working hard for, is for them to look at it and not care and move. Because once they sit and stop at it or pause or question it or wonder about other things because of it, that's when we can run into trouble. And so what we all we're working for is for them to look at that score and be like, I'm not concerned, and move on to the next, for the full 6 minutes they have to read the whole app anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And in general, I mean, I know we're all parents here and I'm a mom. And in general, especially in this period of intense stress and there's competition, tuning out what everyone else is doing is good advice because talk to professionals, talk to Barry, listen to me when I talk to you about these tests. But the sort of oh, my kid did it once and is done, one and done, it's irrelevant to me if they're one and done. And we don't need that kind of pressure put on ourselves as parents and on our children. We need to find what's right for your child. And we have a question. What's the highest level of math a kid needs to complete with a great grade, of course, in high school to do well in SAT or ACT and for college admissions? I'll take the first part. You can take the second part. Generally, for the tests, our students need Algebra 2 and Trig. It doesn't really get too much into pre-calc, a little bit, maybe on the ACT, a little bit, but really once you're done with algebra 2 and trig, algebra 2 trig, you're ready for the math. I will say I have some kids who have not done that and are still doing ACT prep, and that's because it's helping them in their class and they need that time to learn the math simultaneously just because of the timing. But most kids are ready by then to take the SAT, ACT, which is very different than what needs to be done by senior year for college admissions, and I'll leave that to you, Barry.
Yeah, so for college admissions, of course, it depends on, where you're shooting for, but I would say anybody who can eke out calculus, even regular level, it doesn't have to be honors, doesn't have to be AP necessarily, although depending on what kinds of schools you're shooting for, it may in fact very much need to be AP. But my point is just if I'm giving a generic answer, is to take some form of calculus if you are able. The inevitable question that's going to come up is, well, do I take, calculus and get the lower grade instead of taking, whatever honors pre-calculus or whatever it might be that the other option is that's a bit lower, and get the higher grade? And again, my answer would have to be that it depends. It depends what schools you're applying to. It depends what other grades you have, on your transcript. It depends on what kind of fit you are for the school, since ultimately decisions are made based on fit more than anything else, as long as the academics are generally there. So, I would generally say if I had to give just a flat answer, try to get to calculus as best you can with a grade that isn't going to harm you. And then if not, just go to the next best thing, depending on what your high school offers.
And for those families who are other grades, which I assume might be even eighth grade, right? Talk to me about what happens between eighth and ninth, because it is a pivotal moment for placement tests, for figuring out what math you're starting in. And while it's possible to sort of advance into a higher level math track in high school, and we do have kids do that, it gets more challenging to do that, especially since summers are spent in other ways and the math gets more challenging. So those placement exams going into ninth grade, and what math you do take in ninth grade does set a trajectory. I'm sure Barry is counseling kids on this too when she's meeting with them at younger ages. But it is something to forward think about as opposed to land in 11th grade and realize, oh no, I'm never getting to where I was wanted to go. So it's something to think about. Um,
It's always a good idea to kind of work backwards because, to Sasha's point, if you find yourself, you don't even have to find yourself in 11th grade at course selection time. It happens usually much earlier where you realize, yes, grades from grade 7 and 8 aren't ever going to see the light of day in the college admissions process, but how a student does at that point is going to impact how they're tracked into classes in ninth grade, where it does start to count. And grades are obviously super important, but I could easily argue that the rigor is more important. And so if you don't have the rigor, but you have the grades, you'll probably find your expectations and your results, or what the possibilities are likely for you to be off, to not be aligned. So you really want to pay attention to rigor. And it's, again, you don't need to make a middle schooler crazy about anything. But you do want to be mindful of it because it will impact that tracking. And usually once you're on the track, and this is most typically with science and math, is where it comes up most frequently. Of course, there's some element of it in foreign language, but it just doesn't tend to get people so bent out of shape with that, on the foreign language front, because people aren't typically rushing to accelerate beyond what they are capable and able to do, and you don't need to. Um, So it is important to be mindful. Switching gears a little, we had a couple of questions, and you were just mentioning, Sasha, about extracurricular activities. How should parents and kids strategize, or what do you do kind of like after ninth grade and some of the earlier years? Again, a lot of questions that kind of centered around some similar topics. And with the extracurricular activities, for parents in the audience, it's really like 180 degrees different from when we applied. I'm about the age of people who have kids applying to college now. And when we applied, it was very much, you wanted a title, most importantly, like be president or vice president of something. It didn't matter what you did or if you did anything, quite frankly. It was just get that leadership position. You needed to do community service, and that often looked like a soup kitchen or just volunteering at a homeless shelter or something like that. It was just you pick something to do. It didn't really matter what it was, and it was a lot of variations of a similar theme. And just be like a top 10% of your class or just up there in your class. And like you would get into what we would all agree would be today a highly selective school. And it's just not like that anymore. And yes, you need the academics to be part of the conversation, right? So you have to have the rigor and the grades to be considered. But about 80 to 85% of students applying in any pool are academically qualified. They could do the work if admitted, but admissions officers can't admit near anything close to that, no matter what school we're talking about, really. And so, how are decisions made? So, door number one is that academic piece. You've got to be able to walk through door number one to get to door number two. But once you're at door number two, that other stuff is behind you. Decisions are really made based on fit, right? And fit has to do with how the admissions office pulls together its first year class. So you can have 10 different schools on your list. They're all the same academically, looking essentially for the same kind of student numerically, but they all do admissions in their own unique way and find certain students and profiles more and less compelling. And that's what fit is about. So first you have to figure out where you feel you fit. And then you have to figure out what schools are going to think that you fit. How do they figure this out is really a lot of it goes back to your extracurricular activities. It's how you engage with the world, how you choose to spend your time. The what doesn't matter so much. I don't care if you're on the newspaper, if you're in the improv club, or you're in a lab. They're all the same to me, essentially. I want to know, why are you there? Why have you chosen to be there? What have you done while you're there? And what have you done beyond what I could guess you did in a lab as part of the improv group on the newspaper? I can write your activities description if you don't tell me anything. If you tell me you're on the newspaper, if you tell me you were in a lab, I can get a really good one done. But that's not going to be good enough. It should be so specific and unique to you, and what your role is. And the real question becomes, and most of your essay writing, almost all of the supplements that you write are going to pull from your extracurricular activities and how you spend time outside. You will write an academic interest essay that will go to some schools, but there are plenty that won't ask you for an essay about it. They'll ask you in a drop down what you might be interested in. And sometimes your choice of major is going to determine whether or not you're getting in. There's a lot of strategy around choice of major if you're going to even give them an actual choice, because you can certainly say undecided. But the extracurricular activities is a super important piece, and it's really about substance engagement, the why, the how, the so what, how it comes together, how it supports like who you are, and does it make sense? And you will be talking about that in all these different essays with all different topics that prompt you. And the extracurricular piece really develops over time. It's something that, and you might pivot a couple of times, great, as long as there's a reason, it doesn't matter. But what you do after ninth grade should be different than what a rising 12th grader does. We expect more of the rising 12th grader. And there's more time for exploration and some flexibility in grade 9. By at the end of grade 10, you should kind of know what you're doing. And by that, I just mean what your focus is going to be for now. This is not about like what your life's work is and what you're going to do for a living. I don't care about that. Even if you're going to list a major, I don't care about that. But it's all, again, all back to the why and the so what. And if you want your essays to really work for you, if you want to be able to stand out, if you want to be read as more than standard strong in whatever applicant pool you're in, because there's the standard strong at every tier, you're going to need to think about it and be intentional. It doesn't mean you've got to cure a disease. It doesn't mean you have to do a million hours of anything. But it should be intentional. There should be some individualized impact and a whole lot more, that we would talk about. But the extracurricular piece is really, really important. But the beautiful thing about it is you can actually do what you want in terms of what you're doing, the what. Whereas with curriculum, I don't, in a lot of ways, I don't really care, or I can't care too much about what your interests are. I shouldn't be able to look at your transcript necessarily and know what you're interested in. I don't agree with that personally, by the way, but from an admissions standpoint, your grades and your courses on your transcript in high school should not give away like what you're interested in. If you're interested particularly in a highly selective school, there may be some opportunities depending on your high school to put in some of those electives where it reflects your interest. But I'm of course focusing on like the admissions officers do on those five core academic areas.
Yeah, and again, those that goes back to the academic piece. I mean, we spend so much time talking about SATs and ACTs, and I know that is part of door number one. And I'm about to ask you about test optional, so stay tuned for that question, Barry. But um, door number one, as Barry talks about, right? That's the academic profile. That's the time where you're supposed to sort of just look like everyone else, or 85% of the kids at least. Um, but the grades are so important and the rigor is so important. And I want parents to spend more time building that sense in middle school for sure, but in ninth and 10th grade, right? Positioning their children for success before they start worrying about test prep, because it does come first and it is equally or more important than the tests. I mean, Barry's going to speak to that, and also important to all the things that come next in their lives. So, I sometimes am concerned about how much of a lopsided sort of priority there is on these tests, just from the parent perspectives, when really before ninth grade, we should be talking about geometry and what a big conceptual shift that is. And we should be talking about chemistry in 10th grade and how to balance equations, because those kids don't do great on their first geometry test and their first chemistry test. And that's where, you really can make a difference forward looking. And then the tests they certainly come. We'll talk about them, and
There'll be a time for
there'll
those
be a
to move
time.
into like the
Yes,
front area,
yes.
right?
Yes,
Exactly,
exactly.
exactly.
But we have to do these things in the right order. So Barry, test optional, I mean, is it a thing? Where is it a thing? What's
It
the
was funny,
define for it?
the questions we got ranged from test optionals on its way out to since there's test optional, it was sort of both sides of it. And both are true, right? So there are more schools certainly in the last year or two, and even some that are coming online next year, that have brought back required testing. For the Ivy League schools, all 7 out of 8 are test required. Only Columbia is test optional at this point of the Ivies. And then, when we look at what happened in COVID, most schools have remained, at least to this point, test optional. There's also the question of when it's test optional, is there an advantage to submitting scores, or to what extent is the advantage to submitting scores? There's a lot of interesting data about that. Colleges aren't super forthcoming about the percentage who apply and submit scores versus the ones who are admitted and submit or don't submit test scores, but there are ways to get at the data, and some of them do make it available, and it's quite eye-opening and fascinating. There are places where it's a 4x or 6x advantage to having scores submitted. And by scores submitted, I mean solid, good scores for that school, not scores, period. But with test optional, listen, I see it as a safety net if you need it, right? So you want to go in with the mindset of, I need to take these tests. I want to do as well as I possibly can. And if I really struggle and I don't make it, there should likely be options in whatever tier you're at, including in the upper bands too, places that I could apply test optional. Submittable scores are ones that are, if you're looking at the middle 25 to 75%, if you're looking at that mid 50% band, you really want to be at the upper end of it. Okay. So if you're barely squeezing by in the lower part by the 25th percentile, don't say, okay, I'm in the band, submit those. That would most likely, in almost every instance, be a negative and work against you. So, I mean, obviously, you have to talk to a counselor because certain schools, like, I mean, I can't think of an example where being in that lower 25th percentile is a good thing, but I can think of scenarios where it can still work. And it may have to do with what major or school you're applying into. It certainly has to do with your fit and how you look for this school in the first place. But, again, I can give you anomalies and stories for everything. Give me any scenario, and I've done it and have had somebody where it either worked or, to support what you're saying or not. So everything is so individualized. But I would say approach it as if these scores are required. Look to the higher end of the bands, for the scores in terms of what do you submit and what don't you submit. And at some schools, submitting scores, good scores, is going to help you significantly, or maybe better put, not submitting scores may hinder your chances significantly. I would say that really across the boards, being able to submit scores certainly makes it easier to predict what's going to happen. And so that's important as you strategize your list overall. It's important as you choose what to do early and what to not do early. So there's a lot of reasons to kind of think about it, but I would say don't think of it as like forget about testing unless if you're starting out like at such a low score, that even with a tremendous amount of work and moving it up like almost at like Herculean levels,
Points,
and
yeah.
it's still going to not be where it you quite need to match with like where your grades are and like where you're going to shoot for. I would not tell anybody to just, well, still try, like,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, we
go
do
ahead,
have,
Sasha.
yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's a couple things that have happened with test optional. Some of it is that these scores have just kind of become inflated, right? Like it's even the scores have gone up and up and up in terms of what is good. And I just want to quickly note that that band that Barry's talking about, it's widely available online. So if you want to understand the band of a specific college, you can easily find that 25th to 75th percentile and then go, okay, well, this is what's at the 75th or above. And that's what we're usually saying, right? For most kids, we want them at the 75th percentile or above to be competitive, for Barry to feel like good, we can check it off and no one's going to blink. Um, and I guess what I would say is, there are those kids who maybe 10 years ago had to fight for a mediocre score no matter what. And do they still exist? Occasionally in certain situations, maybe for a scholarship, maybe at a very specific school, but generally those kids who were going to just fight and fight and fight for a score that was still not really helpful, they are going to just focus on test optional and they're going to use their time in a better way with those grades, with that rigor at school, with their extracurriculars, there's other ways they should be spending their time. And that's a little bit more common now than it was 10 years ago.
They
Um,
didn't have
but
the option as many places to be able to
exactly.
do that. You
Correct.
had to eke out whatever points you could get, eke them out, no matter what.
And there were schools 10 years ago, frankly, who accepted lower scores and now are like starting to be up in that 33, 34 range that weren't 10 or 15 years ago. So it's just that the landscape has changed a little, but we at Tutor Associates take very seriously trying to be honest about, how do we use our time, right? And how long does it take to move certain scores and why would it take that long for some kids and other kids it's easier or whatever it is. And for the most part, our kids are testing and they're going for scores that make sense for them, for their list. Um, and we don't always know the list when we get started. So sometimes we're just going for a certain high point where we feel it would be good for a lot of lists. And then, of course, there is that sort of fallback, but we try to plan as if there's not. And then for some kids, it just doesn't make sense.
And listen, there are test optional has been a dream for
Yeah,
some students. Like it can
absolutely.
work beautifully, but again, everything has to line up. So when you're thinking on the planning stages, that's what I'm talking about is really kind of thinking of it as like I need to do this. But obviously, if you start out and you can see that the road is just going to be too long and too arduous, and not worth it. Like we've told kids, like just don't do it. Like, even if we had high expectations, you exceeded them, we would still be at a score that we can't really use. Why
And
put somebody through that? Like work
the
smarter, not
money, the
harder.
time, exactly. And I will say there are also kids who, just when we were talking about that timeline, it's so individual. I've had kids who had very high goals, and we waited and we waited and we waited because we were getting accommodations. And I know there are questions about accommodations on these tests. Those are available to kids who have different learning differences or have physical differences or disabilities that allow them, grant them special accommodations on these tests. The
And the
most
colleges don't know that you received them.
Correct. So it is completely anonymous, and uh, some of these the most common one would just be getting extra time, but there are other ones, an enlarged bubble sheet, or answering in your booklet, or there's just a sort of a long list of accommodations available depending on what your child may qualify for. And the accommodations process usually starts, again, this is why I like planning. I want to hear in 10th grade if your child has neuropsych evals, if there is a long history, if there's a new diagnosis that needs to be sort of measured and diagnosed and put into writing. And then we need to know if we're getting that approval before we choose the test because that can make a difference. And then we need to figure out if there can be an appeals process. There's a whole process. So again, every child is so different and has their own path. And I like to plan early, but I don't like to rush the process. And I think that's what we're just coming back to over and over again because each
It's
child
true
is
of
different.
essay writing as well. Like, we'll sometimes have parents who are kind of like, we just need this essay done. We just need it done. And it's like, well, do you want it done or do you want it good? There is two different things, and it just takes time often to get something good. And so whether it's your score or whether it's your college essay or a supplement, it doesn't really matter. We're all just human beings and not robots, at least not yet. And and it just takes time, and it's hard to be patient. I always say, like hurry up and wait. That's sort of the feeling that people have, but it really requires a lot of patience. But you want to get it right. Like I often see people, they've worked so hard and have put all this effort in, and then we're like at that application and essay stage, and that's when they want to rush. And it's like, you've been doing all this stuff for this, and now we're here to actually tell the story, and to share about this. And this is where you want to rush. Like we all want to be done with it, whether it's the testing or the essays when it's our turn, to be working on that stuff with kids. We all want to be done, but our job, your job and our job is to help kids do the very best and present the very best that they can. And so as the process kind of goes on and sometimes feels harder, as long as you have somebody to support you, and whether it's your test prep, your, essay writing, pushing through that end of junior year, whatever it is, don't like kind of sell yourself short. You're gonna like shoot yourself in the foot in the end.
And I
It's
think
so
Barry's pointing out a very important piece, which is that all of that work all that stuff you did, those grades, the rigor, the extracurriculars, the summer programs, it's at the end, they have to be able to read that somehow, right? They have to know, it has to translate to someone who doesn't know your child, right? And that's where Barry is saying, like, that piece where you're telling your story, the story it has to be great. We're trying to forward look that way,
It
right?
can't just
But you
be
can't,
like a telling of it, because if
right?
you read applications and you're reading thousands of them, like I think people can understand how quickly like everyone, kind of seems, they don't really, no one seems really different from one another, right? One person may, work in a lab, and the other person may, be volunteering on a medical mission, and someone else is doing this or that, whatever, and people have different interests, but you're just plugging in different nouns for the interest or the activity. Your job is to compel them to choose you. amongst the other students, 85% of that applicant pool that can do the work. So why should they pick you? Um, and and the why is about you, authentically you, and it's also about connecting that with who the school is, at least how they see themselves. You might see them a little bit different. You know, admissions does things sometimes different than, you know, kind of what the student experience might suggest, but you're never really getting in, not to a place that's like a, you know, a place probably you really want to go. You're never getting in like just because you're smart. You're never getting in just because you have like a high score. You'll get into certain schools, but not the ones you want to go to, you know? And you're going to get in because they feel compelled by you and they can really see you there and they can see you as being part of their community, whatever that looks like to them and however they conceive of that. And you have to tell a story not just about what you've done, because again, that's what the 150 characters, including spaces, are for in the activities grid. The essay is not about like what you've done. Like, I mean, there's a little bit of that in there, but that's not really what it's about. It's about who you are. Because I can look at, you know, a resume or I can look at a transcript and I can see that a student can do everything perfectly if I just give them, you know, the assignment. But I want to know like, well, what do you actually care about and why? And like, what have you done to like really connect with it and make me feel like, you know, it's worthwhile to have you here on my campus. And I think people sometimes or oftentimes think about sort of a list of accomplishments and kind of showing just how smart and how much you've done. And it's like you're focusing on the wrong thing. And then people get confused as to why such strong students don't get into certain schools when it's mostly predictable when that happens. And so really slow down and take the time to do, especially the end of the process right, since you've like been working so hard and put so much effort and time and resources into getting to that point. Like, you know,
Yeah,
don't drop it at the end.
and because they are teenagers, and because you are their loving parents. I mean, I think I was just talking about this because I have a sixth grader and a little guy too. But as they become adolescents and there's that individuation, I do think it's important to surround them with adults you trust that are not just you, because it can become so stressful. And having Barry in your corner, right? But have her focusing on those essays. I mean, we've all seen, what happens when when I get involved in math tests, and it's just someone else should. But seeing what it's like to have Ginny, my daughter, have mentors in the world who I trust and who are helping her with whatever it is she needs, it's a really valuable piece of this process, and it alleviates a lot of stress from your family. And so, I can't say enough. Like when I look at what my tutors do, I mean, the feedback is yes, we got the score, but it's also like, and you made her believe she could do it. And she loves how you taught her math. It's those are the things that stay in my mind. And I think it's the same thing with Barry's work at Expert Admissions. Her counselors, they really are those trusted mentors. And I'm all for surrounding your kid with those people during adolescence when maybe they are rolling their eyes a little more at
A
parents.
little more.
A little more. More. My first grader still hasn't learned that, but so I mean I know there's endless specifics, and I think, and I'll follow up after, we'll both follow up after this with the recording, but also with our contact information, because I think what's most important is having conversations about your child. Like, are they the rower, right? Are they in algebra 2 trig as a 11th grader? Are they, where are they in the process? What are their summers look like? Where are you? Are you in 8th grade? Are you in 11th grade already? Because each conversation should really be different, and then we can figure out how we can help you.
Yeah, I always say in admissions, the answer is it depends. I mean, really always. Like I have to, I need some more info before I can answer you. I had a conversation earlier this fall with like a friend, like a kind of side conversation about their kid. And were talking, I was, you know, giving some kind of quick advice. And then we hung up and then I wrote to them and I was like, you know what I realized? I didn't ask you about the rigor because you were talking, you just kind of quickly, you know, kind of in conversation. I didn't ask you about the rigor because I'm just assuming that it's there. And I just realized that I just didn't ask. And my advice would actually change pretty significantly. And the person wrote back and actually said, oh, no, it's not actually rigor. But I just assumed because they were talking about certain schools and going there early, I just assumed we had the shared understanding of what the basics were.
Right.
And so it's really important to make sure like you're thinking about the particulars, because the answer really does change when, one piece might even just change, one class or one grade or, activities that there are impressive, but there's not that individualized impact. And what school are we talking about? And all of that. So,
This is why
super
we
individualized.
this is why we avoid dinner parties, Barry. 'Cause-
I met someone the other day who was telling me about their kid's college experience. I did not. I acted like I knew nothing about what
Yeah,
we're talking
I
about.
do the same. It's usually the hallways of my kids' school. I'm like, it's just
I don't give a
but
rag.
we will happily chat during our office hours.
Okay.
Well, thank you
Oh,
so
hold
much
on. We
for
have a couple of, just wait real
oh,
fast.
we
One
have more
second. A
questions
couple
in
of
the
questions.
Q&A.
We have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
How do recommendations fit into the presentation of a candidate? Does anyone care? Yes, 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 yes. Do they matter? Yes. They matter so much. And I would say the more selective a school, the more they matter. But that doesn't just mean get glowing recommendations. Like you want to really think about who you're choosing and the way you might approach a recommender, certainly even for grad school, but also like for a job, you wouldn't necessarily use the same rubric for who's a good recommender. And so sometimes who to choose is kind of a little bit counter to common sense or conventional wisdom with the college admissions process, but you'll find that a lot of things are counter to common sense and conventional wisdom in the college admissions process. So the short answer is that the recommendations matter a lot. And there are places that don't require them or that require fewer, but the more selective the school, the more important and crucial they can be to decision making. Um, how do colleges other than small liberal arts schools view or arts colleges view IB versus AP if both offered? So if both are offered, usually it depends on the school. Sometimes they'll allow kids to cherry pick, IB classes and mix them with APs. AP is always a cherry picking expedition. No matter where you are, you don't have to take a full slate. You pick and choose individually. Um, if you're able to take the full diploma for IB, that's obviously a good option. Some people are taking a certificate. It really depends on the student. I would say that for students who are interested in engineering and STEM, the IB can if you have another option like AP, that IB can sometimes be a little trickier. But it's such an individualized thing. But it really depends on what the offerings are, because also not all AP classes are created equal. So, what AP classes are we talking about that your school offers, and which ones would you take? And there's an extended essay and a lot of other things with IB. So, a certain type of student will not fare well in that. So, again, it goes back to it depends on what the school offers and what kind of student you have, and where you might be applying.
And for that final question, yes, it's within 3 years for a typical accommodation. It really does depend a little bit. When we're talking about um, ADHD or dyslexia, dyslexia, for example, both ACT and SAT expect a long track record of this, right? This is not something that is usually diagnosed in high school. It's usually caught in elementary school. So that's something that they'll expect a long record for. ADHD, within 3 years, a diagnosis, yes. Um, and they do need up-to-date neuropsych evaluations. There are also disabilities that are brand new, an injury that allows you that you can't sit for very long periods of time or something with eyesight. So those are different and they fall under different categories. But in general, I like to say within 3 years, you're good. And also just in terms of testing, we're often testing around then anyway, because we need to update our neuropsych evals. But we can talk more about that. But yes, 3 years.
All right. Well, thank you to everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to follow up with us. Thank you for submitting questions and for spending your evening together. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
good night.
you. Bye.